Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in. You're listening to Home in Progress, sponsored by RepcoLite Paints and Benjamin Moore. And coming up on the show this week, we're going to cover a lot of ground. But some of that ground is going to have to be a surprise. And I know that's maybe kind of dumb, but I want to talk about something related to my Winter Woodshop series that I started last week. But I don't want to tell you what it is because the intro for it is kind of fun. And if I spill the beans now, it won't be as fun. You'll know what's coming. So I'm going to keep it a surprise and just ask you to stay tuned based on, my word that it's going to be worth it. So that's coming up. But right now, I want to jump into a conversation that I had the other day with a young couple who are buying their very first home. All right, very, very first home, new homeowners. They were talking to me and they had a ton of questions, absolute ton of questions. Now, both had some experience with painting, but never really painting from the point of view, where they were the ones picking the products and the colors and all of that. It was always at other people's houses. They'd show up to help somebody and they'd just be handed some paint and some supplies and some tools and they'd be set to work. Now they're driving the project and they were unsure about a number of things. Now, the questions they had were great. And I'm going to move through as many of them as I can because I really think it's going to help a lot of people. The questions weren't just newbie questions. They were really good all-around paint questions. For example, the first question that they had was this. They bought the house and one of the rooms has, bright pink walls. It's not terrible. I saw pictures. I kind of like it, but it's not what they want in that space. And as they were starting to talk through new color options, they both leaned towards something much darker. So the question that they were asking was eventually this: won't a darker color hide that bright pink way better than a lighter or a mid-tone color? So they're choosing that darker color because they're thinking it's going to hide that bright pink better. Will it? Well, it turns out the answer to that is complicated. And here's why. Most lighter colors and mid-tone paint colors are tinted from bases that already contain a good amount of white pigment, specifically titanium dioxide. Now, that white pigment in those bases, that does a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to hiding what's underneath. Really dark colors, we tend to think those are going to cover and hide really well, but really dark colors are quite different. They're tinted from what's called, for lack of a better phrase, what's called a clear base. And that base doesn't contain that white pigment, that titanium dioxide that I talked about. If that were in there, we couldn't get them to the depth of color that we're trying to get them to. It has to be out of there so that the colorants can do the work. And that means that the hiding power of a darker color is going to rely pretty heavily, if not exclusively, on the colorants themselves. Now, the good news is that colorant technology, like everything else, has improved dramatically. Benjamin Moore's Gen X colorants and the newer system that we use at RepcoLite both feature high hiding colorants. Now, because of that, dark colors hide way better today than they ever have before. But, and this is important, not all dark colors are going to hide equally well. So a vivid blue or a strong red often has less hiding power than a deeper, more complex color like a navy or a burgundy. Some colorants simply don't hide as well as others, and reds in particular are notoriously challenging. When those reds are blended into darker, more muted colors using other colorants, hiding improves. So while a darker color can hide a bright pink better than a mid-tone, it's not a guarantee. It really is going to depend on the specific color that you choose. And that's why the real answer here isn't just about picking the right color, it's about following the right process. It's a situation where a primer really can make a huge difference. Tinting a primer to gray, for example, can neutralize that bright pink before you ever apply your finish coat. And that makes whatever color you end up choosing behave the way that it's supposed to. And paint choice is another thing that you should consider. The paint choice matters. Products like Benjamin Moore's Aura, for example, they're engineered for extremely high hiding power. RepcoLite's Optima is another excellent product when it comes to hiding. So if you're painting over a strong color, and you want to do everything you can to minimize coats and frustration, it's absolutely worth asking about, one of those higher end products. And RepcoLite's Optima comes at a great price point. So definitely something to look into. If you're dealing with those funky colors, something really bright. The big takeaway in all of this, this particular question is this. Questions like this one don't usually have a one-size-fits-all answer. It'd be really nice if we could just, you ask the question and here's the straight-up answer. But there's always so many other questions that have to be asked and answered before you really can settle on what's the right path for a given situation. And because of that, the best results are going to come from stopping out at any RepcoLite and talking to us about the color that you want to cover over. What are you dealing with? Bring us some pictures. Show us what you're working against. Show us the color you want to get to, the color you want to bring into that space. And then from that, we can help you figure out what products and what steps you need to take to get there most efficiently. So first step, stop out at a RepcoLite store and talk through your exact situation with us. That's going to help us figure out if you need primer, tinted primer, what product to use, all of that. All right, the second question they had to do with the kitchen backsplash. It was a tile backsplash, but they really didn't like it. And since replacing tile is a pretty big project, they wondered if there was a way they could just paint it, for now, just to get them by until they were ready to tackle a full replacement down the road. Well, the short answer here is, yeah, you can paint the tile. Now, it's not a permanent solution, and you may need to touch it up from time to time to keep it looking good. But if you do it right, it can absolutely work and buy you some time. The key is the primer. You want something that's going to truly bond to those slick surfaces. And for that, I really like to recommend sticks from Insulax, S-T-I-X, sticks from Insulax. It's one of the best bonding primers I've ever used, especially on tough-to-paint surfaces like tile. So start with a thorough cleaning using TSP, trisodium phosphate, or a good degreaser like Crud Cutter. Clean the tile well, rinse it well. And if you do want to lightly scuff sand, that's fine. Just make sure you do it after the cleaning. And then make sure you wipe everything down after you've scuff sanded with a damp rag. Once it's dry, prime with sticks, and then top coat with a high-quality paint, probably in an eggshell or a satin finish so it's washable. Good options are going to include Benjamin Moore Regal Select, Scuff X, Advance, or RepcoLite's Optima. Any of those would work well, and there are other options out there as well. Just stop in and ask about it. This is going to work well for backsplashes, not for wet areas like shower surrounds, so keep that in mind. Those were just the first two questions that they had. They had more, and we're going to get to those right after this. Home in Progress is brought to you by RepcoLite Paints and Benjamin Moore. People often think of paint as just another line item on the project supply list. But here's the thing. Everything you do, every hour of prep, every stroke of the brush, all comes down to the quality of the paint. The paint is the project. Make sure it's the best. We're working our way through some questions that I was asked by some new homeowners, and while they're kind of new at the whole painting thing, the questions they had are great. And so we're talking about them here. I think it's going to help a lot of people as you work through your own design and decorating stuff at home. Now, the next question that they had to do with the trim in this house that they're looking at. The house was full of baseboards that were big and beautiful, very old-fashioned trim, so looked really good. It was all painted, but that big old trim. And naturally, they were wondering, what that would look like underneath all the paint. They were kicking around the idea of stripping the baseboards down and exposing that wood, bringing it back to life, and then restoring them to their original state. And they were wondering what that process would look like. How bad is that work going to be? Because it'd be really nice to bring that wood back to its original form. Well, once again, just like the last question that we dealt with in the first segment, the answer to this one is complicated as well. And the main reason that it's complicated is due to the age of the house. If paint was applied any time before 1978, and especially in a home built in the 1940s or something, I forget how old their house was. It's older, though. A house built in that age, or any paint renovations and stuff like that done prior to 1978, if you've got that situation, there's a really good chance that at least some of the paint that was put on in that application contains lead. So lead-based paint. That was eliminated in 1978 or so. So after that, we don't see it. Prior to 1978, lead-based paint is probably present in your home. Now, here's the thing to understand with lead-based paint. It's not especially dangerous, really, when it's intact and when it's sealed under newer coats of paint, when it's encapsulated. The real risk spikes when you disturb it. When you're sanding it, when you're scraping it, when you're stripping it. Windows, when they're moved up and down, open and closed, that friction can create some dust, and that lead dust can be problematic. So windows are sometimes a concern. And the concern is what I just implied. It's the dust. It's not, paint chips or anything like that. Specifically, it's mainly that lead dust that you create by disturbing it, scraping it, opening, closing those windows if it's lead-based paint in those tracks. Lead dust is microscopic. It gets everywhere, settles on the floors. It gets in your furniture. It gets in your clothing if you're not wearing the appropriate gear. It can get tracked throughout the whole house. It can even get pulled into the HVAC system. And once you've created that lead dust, it usually spreads way farther than people expect it to. And that's why, dry scraping or sanding old trim is a really bad idea. You don't want to do that. Chemical paint strippers, they can help reduce the dust, which is good, but you're still removing paint that may contain lead, so you do need to be careful in a situation like that. So with this particular question, with this particular, house, when they ask me the question, what do you do in a situation like that? Do you bite off the project and jump in? Do you just skip over it? Well, the fact that the house is empty, that there are no kids, no pets, not even any adults living there, that does make things safer in this situation. But even then, you do have to ask yourself whether the project is really worth it. Personally, here's how I'd look at it. If the trim is historically significant, or architecturally special, and you're restoring maybe a small controlled area that you can fully isolate, then maybe it's worth considering. Just understand that you're stepping into lead paint territory and you need to treat it seriously. But even then, it's a lot of work, ton of work. Chemical paint removers, they're not cheap. And with recent VOC regulation changes that we've had here in Michigan, last couple of years, they're also not as aggressive or as effective as they used to be. And that means more time, more product, more effort, all of that. In most situations, especially those in a first house, I kind of think the drawbacks, for me at least, the drawbacks outweigh the benefits. Between the expense, the labor involved, the added concerns that come with working around lead-based paint, and the unknown. You don't know what that trim looks like underneath. It may not be the beautiful wood that you're expecting to find. With all of those in play here, it can quickly turn into a non-starter for a lot of folks. In many cases, the smarter move is really the simpler one. Just clean the trim really thoroughly, repair what needs to be repaired, get fixed what needs fixing, and then give it a fresh coat of paint. Benjamin Moore's Advance, it's a waterborne alkyd. It's basically an oil-based paint that you can clean up with soap and water. That's a simple way to think about it. The fact that it's oil-based or it has that nature to it means it self-levels beautifully. It doesn't dry as fast as water-based products will, and so it self-levels beautifully. Brush strokes are going to fade right out of it. If it's brushed and rolled, it's going to almost give you a sprayed-like finish. It can look absolutely beautiful. So that on this trim can look amazing, and it doesn't, you're not tapping into any of the concerns with dealing with lead-based paint if you go that route. It's faster, it's safer, and it still makes the space look amazing. So everybody's got to make their own decision there, but you've got to understand what you're getting into when you're talking about stripping trim down in an older house. All right, that was the third question they had. The fourth question they had was revolving around color again. And this time they were asking, because they were very eager to start choosing paint colors for the space. It's what we do. We walk through a new house or a house that we're looking at, and most of the time, the big conversations are, well, I can change this, I can change that color, I can do this, I can paint over here. And we're already thinking, our brain is already thinking about the colors that we're going to bring into those spaces. It's a natural default. Whenever anybody does any kind of renovation in their home, I can't say everybody. When a lot of people do a renovation or a redecorating or anything like that in their home, a lot of the times they want to start at the paint store. But the thing is, when you do that, you're potentially decorating out of order. There really is an order to filling a home when it comes to design and decorating. And paint colors, it comes way later than most people think it's going to come. In a new house, especially when it's empty, a new house, in a house that you bought, a house that's new to you, especially when it's empty, the temptation is incredibly powerful to want to paint everything right away. You're not moving furniture. You're maybe not worried about the flooring and stuff like that. It's really tempting to want to get everything painted. And sometimes people want very specific colors. We've seen that. They've got a big plan for how they're going to bring color throughout this new space to them, and they're in the paint store picking those colors out so they can get painting, and then they'll go and get their furniture and stuff. Sometimes they think we'll just paint everything a nice neutral, and then we'll figure out all the furniture and the flooring, the other stuff that we need later, down the road. Either way, whichever path you choose, you've got specific colors or you're picking a neutral, either way, you're decorating out of order at that point. And that can cause a lot of frustration down the road. And here's why. Paint is infinitely adjustable. At RepcoLite, we have thousands and thousands of colors, and if none of those are just right, we can custom match just about anything. When it comes to paint, there are pretty much no limits. Furniture, on the other hand, lots of limits. You find a couch that you love, and maybe, if you're lucky, it comes in 20 different colors. Flooring options, they're going to be limited. You'll find what you want, but you've got X number of colors in that style that you can choose from. Countertops, same thing. Cabinets, same thing. So the smarter approach is to start with those less flexible choices first. Figure out the furniture that you're going to be putting in the space, or at least narrow it down and lock in the colors. If you're replacing cabinets, countertops, or flooring, make those selections first. Once those big pieces are chosen and you can see how they relate to each other, then it's time to start looking at paint colors. If you do it the other way around, painting everything first, you're making it much harder to find furniture, flooring, or finishes that actually work with the color that you picked. And that's why so many people end up repainting rooms shortly after they move in. Now, one more thing. A lot of people assume, I mentioned it earlier, they assume that choosing a neutral paint color gives them a blank canvas. They know they don't want to pick a bunch of specific colors because they don't want to get locked in. So they'll just go with a neutral so they can get everything painted right now. Well, here's the thing. Neutrals really can be incredibly tricky. Every single color has undertones, and those undertones don't always show up clearly on a paint chip. I've personally done this. I've had walls that I painted what I thought was an incredibly neutral color, a true neutral. I was certain of it. And then I brought in a neutral colored chair that we found, a year after that. And suddenly the wall, I realized, had red undertones and the chair had green undertones. And together they were hideous. Absolutely terrible. Separate, they were fine. If I could put the chair in the front yard and you could kind of look through the window at the colors in the living room, fine. But putting the chair in the living room, nope, it was a no-go. I had to repaint or get rid of the chair. And I like that chair, so we repainted. The bottom line is this. When you can, save your paint color decisions for near the end of the process. That's going to be a way better way to go. Start with the items that give you the fewest choices first, and then let paint be the flexible piece that ties everything together. It's simpler, it's going to be way less frustrating, and it's going to lead to a better, result in the end. Okay, there are more questions that they had, but that's all the time that I've got to focus on this. Just remember, if you've got paint questions of your own, RepcoLite's the place to get them answered. We've been doing this for 80 years now. Started in 1946 in Holland, Michigan, making our own paint at that point, and we've been doing it ever since then. So we've got our own brand. We've got all these other national brands, including Benjamin Moore, that we work with. And all the people in all of our locations are ready to help you with whatever you're working on or dealing with. I guarantee you, whatever you're dealing with, no matter how crazy it seems, we've seen it and we've helped people work through it. So swing out to any RepcoLite and get your questions answered. All right. Have you ever heard of a lac bug? I'm switching gears dramatically here. Have you ever heard of a lac bug? It's a real bug. It's an insect that lives primarily in India or Southeast Asia. And you have definitely, whether you've heard of them or not, you've definitely encountered these bugs and their secretions. In fact, you may be encountering those secretions right this very minute. I'll tell you what I mean and why I'm talking about it right after this. Home in Progress is brought to you by RepcoLite Paints and Benjamin Moore. Think about it. You spend hours prepping, sanding, taping, and then finally painting. Don't throw all that work away with an inferior product. The paint isn't just another supply. The paint is the project. Make sure it's the best. There are these bugs that live mostly in India and Southeast Asia, and they're called lac bugs. And I can almost guarantee you that you and they have a history of sorts. Like I said at the end of the last segment, you've encountered them, and more specifically, you've encountered some of their secretions in the past, and it's even possible that you're encountering these secretions this very moment. All right, here's the deal. The lac bugs cruise around on trees. Like I said, in India, Southeast Asia, they're cruising around on trees, up and down the branches. They're living the big life, right? As far as they can. They're bugs. They're not, it's not that great. But, they're doing cool bug stuff. And the female lac bugs, well, as they're doing that, they're busy biting into the branches and sucking out, the sap. They're just munching on it. And then that ingested sap is chemically modified inside their little bug bodies, and then it's secreted as a thick, resinous liquid. Now, they don't spit it out. It's not how they secrete it. And they don't send it out through the other possible area that you might be thinking about. That would be excreting it. They don't do that. Instead, they've got special secretion glands on their body, and that's how they do it. So they secrete this resinous material, and then in the air, it quickly hardens into this protective, shell-like tube that covers the insect. It often will coalesce with other secretions from other, nearby female lac bugs on those same branches, and it can become this continuous coating over full branches, of these trees or whatever. Anyway, they create this shell for protection so the female bug and her eggs are safe from predators, from desiccation, drying out, and environmental stress of all kinds. So they create these little these little resin protective shell-like homes to kind of hang out in. All right? That's the female lac bug and the secretions. But I said you probably have encountered them and could be encountering them right now. Here's what I mean by that. Those secretions, they're harvested, and then they're turned into something that is used in so many ways, it's absolutely amazing. For example, if you're right now enjoying a snack of, let's say, jelly beans, maybe Skittles, maybe Reese's Pieces, maybe candy corn. Does anybody really enjoy candy corn? It's just something that what a weird texture. And it's just like sugar. It's just straight sugar. There's no taste to it other than sweet and kind of gummy but crumbly candy corn. I loved it when I was a little kid. I don't even want to be in the same room with candy corn as an adult. But anyway, if you're loving on candy corn, you be you. Whoppers, those little guys, right? Junior Mints. All of those things. If you're eating those kinds of goodies, you're eating things that are coated with lac bug secretions. Not on accident. Not like lac bugs got into the plant and kind of secreted on the boxes and stuff. It's put there by people who intend to put it there. Now, of course, it's been rigorously purified, but still. The stuff on the candies that gives it the shine and makes the candies look oh so good and amazing is basically just bug secretions, all right? But it doesn't stop there. Apples and a number of other fruits, the ones that look a little shiny in the store, yep, sprayed on bug secretions. It's also sprayed on nuts, cakes, and coffee beans. And the purpose is to give all of those things an appealing shine, but also to prevent moisture loss. We don't want them to get all desiccated. It's to extend shelf life and provide other preservation effects. All right? So you could encounter it in snacks, but maybe you're sitting there right now kind of feeling high and mighty and thinking you're not a snacker. And maybe you don't eat a lot of fruit, but you're still, even if you avoid those things, you're still sucking down bug secretions. I'm absolutely sure of it. You've heard the whole apple a day keeps the doctor away thing, right? We've all heard that. If you're not eating apples, coated with bug secretions, then you're really, very likely visiting the doctor, right? Apple a day keeps the doctor away. If you're not eating the apple, of course, you're heading to the doctor on a regular basis, and any pills that they prescribe that have time-release coatings, those coatings are made from lac bug secretions as well. These secretions are used in nail polish, makeup binder. They're used to stiffen hats. They're used on leather. They're used in hundreds of other weird and unexpected ways. And on top of all of that, and this is the reason that we're talking about it in the first place, on top of all of those things, they're also used to create a common wood finish that you've most likely heard of, shellac. All right? The process of making furniture-grade shellac is definitely different from making food-grade shellac. But it's not that different. It's kind of surprising how not different it is. In both instances, The lac bug secretions are scraped off the branches, sometimes lac bugs and all. They're processed, they're cleaned, they're melted, they're dried, and eventually they're turned into shellac flakes. And I should pause for 1 second because of this, because of the fact that candies and apples and things like that are coated with shellac bug secretions. It makes those items unintentionally non-vegan, which doesn't matter to me, but there are people who get all up in arms and want to boycott these items because they're non-vegan or they're harming the bugs, because the bugs don't usually survive the process. It's not necessarily the process that kills them entirely, but the process isn't very great for the bugs. A lot of them die naturally. You know, that's just part of their life cycle. They secrete the stuff, they lay their eggs, they die. But still, there's a lot of bug loss here. So if you're a big bug fan, shellac is probably problematic for you. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. It was an interesting little rabbit hole I stumbled down, and I was going to convey that if I got a chance. And of course, since I kind of run the show now, I get all the chances I want. All right, so getting back to food grade shellac and furniture grade shellac, I said they're of course made differently, but they're not as different as you might want to think. So the secretions are harvested, they're turned into flakes, and basically it takes about 100,000 bugs to make a single pound of shellac. So a lot of bugs were lost in the making of this pound of shellac. And once the flakes are gathered, they're purified if they're going to be for food use. They're then dissolved, usually for food use, in a non-denatured ethyl alcohol, basically grain alcohol, to avoid adding any toxins to the product. All right, so those flakes, they're dissolved in grain alcohol, and then they can be sprayed on all these food items, and they give it that wonderful glow. Furniture shellac is made and dissolved in denatured alcohol instead, or another alcohol, but an alcohol with more toxins is really the big difference. That's about it. That's the big difference between food grade and furniture grade shellac. All right, think about that for a little bit. That's my fun intro. Now let's dig into shellac as a finish. You know, last week I started a weekly winter wood shop series that I wanted to do, and it's a great time of year, I think, for heading out to the shop to do woodworking, maybe to refinish furniture, who knows. But if you do any woodworking at all, you most likely have run into some confusion when it comes to wood finishes. You know, there are a lot of options out there, and a lot of woodworking websites have their favorites, and they promote them for a lot of different projects. And sometimes those recommendations just aren't very good. So I thought I'd take a few weeks and talk about some of the most common wood finishes out there and walk you through the pros and cons of each one. Last week, we talked about tung oil. This week, it's shellac. And even if you're not a woodworker, shellac has a really interesting history beyond just that bug secretion angle, and a wide variety of uses that can be helpful for any homeowner to know. And we're going to dig into all of that right after this. You're listening to Home in Progress, where the projects are real, the mistakes, they're educational, sometimes painful, mostly educational, and the only thing more stubborn than that old wallpaper on your bathroom wall is your determination to get it fixed. Proudly sponsored by RepcoLite Paints and Benjamin Moore. Paint with a purpose, people who care, and everything you need to get the job done right. And we're back. You're listening to Home in Progress, sponsored by RepcoLite Paints and Benjamin Moore. RepcoLite Paints and Benjamin Moore. Someday I will fully complete this puberty journey and I'll have fully arrived at adulthood. But that day is not today. And I don't think this is going to be my year for it. But one of these years, it will happen. Anyway, you're listening to Home in Progress, sponsored by RepcoLite Paints and Benjamin Moore. Why? Because the paint is the project. All right, talking about shellac, I mentioned last segment how the flakes of shellac, the lac bug resin secretions, how they're largely the same whether the shellac is being used on food as a confectioner's glaze or on a dresser as a protective finish. Well, the main difference is the type of alcohol those flakes are dissolved in. Well, speaking of dissolving shellac flakes in alcohol, if you go right now and search Amazon, you can find bags and bags of shellac flakes. I bet you didn't know that. Some of you did, but I bet some of you didn't. Just Google it, shellac flakes, and you'll find them. These are the Lac Bug secretions. You can buy them as flakes, and you can actually mix them yourself and make your own shellac. I've got a video link in the show notes for this episode if you want to check it out. Just go to RepcoLite.com, click the On the Radio tab, and then find the January 17 episode, the latest episode, and there you go. If you want to look at how it's done, that guy will walk you through it in about 8 minutes. But basically, you just snag some of these flakes and you dissolve them in alcohol. Denatured alcohol works. You can get that at our stores. I've seen a lot of woodworker sites recommend that you get regular grain alcohol, something from the liquor store. Either way, you dissolve the flakes in alcohol and you can make your own shellac. Now, there's more to it. The proportions to mix and how long you need to agitate it, how you agitate it, all of that. But if you are interested, dig into it. It's really pretty cool in a way. Now, all right, if you don't want to mix your own shellac, like bootleg shellac, you can also buy pre-mixed shellac. The most common one that people recognize is bullseye shellac from Zinsser. It's convenient, works well. We've got quarts of it at most of our stores. So you can get it that way. Shellac comes in a range of different colors. It can be very pale blonde all the way through orange and into almost like deep browns. Orange shellac is probably that classic, most classic, that it's that traditional version, that warm tone that you associate with older furniture and woodwork. That's the orange shellac. And those colors are largely dependent on the sap and what particular tree the lac bugs are getting, are eating or munching on, the sap that they're munching on. That determines the color. All right. Now, shellac, it's one of those products that people either romanticize or they completely dismiss. On the one hand, it gets talked about like some magical lost art. You're going to find websites where they just laud, all the benefits of shellac. On the other hand, you can find other places where it's written off as obsolete, something that belonged to another era, another century, another millennia, and something that doesn't have a place in modern shops. Well, the truth, I think, is somewhere in between. Shellac is old technology, really old. I mean, it's hard to even call it technology. It's bug secretions dissolved in alcohol. That's it. There's not a lot of bells and whistles here. But with that said, it still does a few specific things better than almost anything else. And I love that. That is so crazy cool to me. And once you understand how it functions and where it excels, then its place in the wood shop and around the house becomes really clear. So historically, shellac was the finish. For centuries, furniture, cabinets, trim, wood paneling, almost all of it was always finished with shellac for the most part. If you walked into a woodworking shop before the early 20th century, that's what you were going to see on the shelf. You'd see lots of shellac. The dominance started to fade in the 1920s, 1930s, something like that, when nitrocellulose lacquer took over professional finishing. Lacquer dried fast, it sprayed beautifully, and it held up better to heat, moisture, and just daily abuse, especially as manufacturing became faster and more industrial. Now, shellac didn't disappear, but it did stop being the default go-to product. And once that happened, its limitations became a little more obvious. It could be compared to lacquer, and you could see where it didn't really hold up. And that's where a lot of shellac's reputation problems come from. You're often going to hear that shellac turns white with water. Now, in reality, it's not completely 100% true. Fresh shellac is reasonably water resistant. It's not waterproof, but it's also not instantly ruined by a little bit of moisture. Most of the dramatic issues and failures that people talk about, they come from very thin coats, prolonged exposure, or shellac that's already past its usable life, because shellac has a limited lifespan. If it's pre-mixed, a lot of the time you can buy it and it's got about a 3-year lifespan. If you mix it, from the flakes, like we talked about earlier, it's got about a 1-year lifespan. And after that, you don't want to use it, and you can run into a lot of issues. So a lot of the gripes and failures came about from shellac that was old, just too old. Another common criticism is that shellac scratches easily. And while shellac, it's not designed to compete with modern high-build coatings, it's worth understanding how it actually behaves. It's not as bad as you might be led to believe. Compared to lacquer, shellac is less brittle. That doesn't mean lacquer's weak. Lacquer's extremely durable, and it revolutionized finishing for a reason. But what it does mean is that when lacquer fails, it tends to crack or craze, while shellac tends to wear or soften. Shellac is also really easy to repair. It redissolves into itself, so scratches, wear spots, and touch-ups, they can often be blended without stripping or sanding, an entire surface. That repairability is one of the reasons shellac stuck around so long after it stopped being fashionable. Now, another criticism that it gets is that shellac is simply old-fashioned, right? This one really misses the point because there's some old people, I'm thinking about myself, that are still pretty current. We still got something. In fact, I like to think we're just hitting our prime, But anyway, shellac shouldn't be thought of as just simply old-fashioned and that it should be discarded. Shellac didn't get replaced because it was bad. It got replaced because priorities changed. Durability under abuse, resistance to heat and chemicals, and faster production became more important than ease of repair and all of that. So that's why it was replaced. But there are still plenty of jobs where shellac isn't just acceptable. An acceptable solution. There are a lot of jobs and situations that homeowners run into on a daily basis where shellac is the ideal fix. And when I talk about these, I want to mention that there's the clear shellac, which is what we've been talking about so far, but there's also a white pigmented shellac. You probably know it as bin primer from Zinsser, if you've ever used that. It's a white pigmented shellac. So keep that in mind as I'm working through this. It's not just about clear coats. All right, one of the ideal uses for shellac these days is in stain and odor blocking. Shellac is one of the best sealers available for locking in tannin stains, smoke damage, water stains, and persistent odors. Furniture restorers use it constantly for this reason. And often, when they do, they're working with a clear shellac because it allows them to seal in whatever problems they found without committing to a final look. You can still paint over it if you want to. You can still distress over it. You can still apply a decorative finish on top of it. So a lot of furniture refinishers use it. And tannin stains, I should probably mention what that is in case you're not sure what I'm talking about. Tannins are naturally occurring chemicals that are found in certain woods, and most of the time, they're not a problem at all. They really only become an issue when you're trying to paint the wood, especially if you use the wrong primer or you skip a primer altogether. Tannins are water extractive, which means that when you apply a water-based primer or paint, those chemicals can dissolve and migrate to the surface. And that's when you see brown or yellow stains bleeding through your paint. A thin coat of shellac on the surface before you put your paint down is going to seal those tannins in so you can put the latex paint over top without any bleed-through problems at all. Same thing with water stains, same thing with smoke damage, same thing with unpleasant odors. So if you're refinishing an old piece of furniture and it has that old furniture smell or a smoke smell or anything like that, shellac is often the answer. It's going to seal the odor in so you don't have to worry about it coming back later. You'll also see a lot of finishers clean up the inside of dresser drawers and the dressers themselves and then seal it all in with shellac. So they'll get it all cleaned up, do some sanding, seal it with shellac, and that will seal in any of the old smells that furniture is carrying with it. It dries fast, it's durable enough for drawer use, inside the drawers, and it does a great job of locking in those odors. And beyond just problem solving, shellac is also a period authentic finish, if you're doing antique furniture. If you're restoring an older piece and you don't want to use a polyurethane or a modern finish, shellac is an old proven solution that's still really appropriate today, provided you don't need, extreme durability on the piece. So shellac, it definitely has its place. There's a lot of good places to use it, but it's important also to be clear about where it doesn't belong. High moisture environments are a problem. Bathrooms and kitchens near sinks, don't want to do that. Alcohol exposure is another issue. Its base is alcohol, so being exposed to alcohol is a big issue, which makes it a really bad choice for bar tops and dining tables and things like that. Heat can soften it. High traffic surfaces like floors and heavily used tabletops, they're way better served by going to a more modern finish like a polyurethane. So here's the real takeaway. Shellac, it's not a miracle product, but it's not outdated junk either. It's incredibly interesting in how it came to be, and that old technology that it's built on still does a few things, a few specific jobs remarkably well. And when you need those jobs done, blocking stains, sealing odors, nothing else really works quite as well. All right, that's going to do it for this episode. If you want to catch it again, you can find it online at RepcoLite.com. Just click the On the Radio tab right on the homepage, and you can find all of our episodes right there. And if you have any paint questions at all, I know I answered a bunch of paint questions at the beginning of the show. If you have paint questions of your own that you'd love answered, just send them my way. You can reach me at radio@repcolite.com. Whatever you do today, make sure paint's a part of it. For Home in Progress, I'm Dan Hansen. Thanks for listening.